My name is Joel. I'm lead pastor here. Thanks for coming. Happy Mother's Day. And not many people know this, but I actually have a mom. And so, no, we love you, moms. We're thankful for you. But in my position as a pastor, I have to spend a lot of time, I get to spend a lot of time at weddings, actually. I go to a lot of different weddings, and it also means that I do a lot of premarital counseling with young couples as well. And honestly, it's one of my favorite types of counseling, honestly, because in every other type of counseling, these two people that are just like actively angry at each other. But with premarital counseling, it's like, here's two young folks that are just blissfully in love. And so it's actually one of the more enjoyable things. And but you know, whenever we go through it here, I always tell them a few different things. And one of the nights, usually, we actually just take time and like, all right, let's just plan the ceremony, get this out of the way, make sure we're all on the same page and know exactly what's going to happen here. And as we go through that, I always remind them of something. I just tell them, like, right up front, something will go wrong, right? Like, I know it's a perfect day. I know it's a day that you've been planning for a long time, but like something is going to go wrong. I just promise you every time, whether it's something small or something big. I've seen it all. One of my favorites, honestly, has always been, it's not probably the bride's favorite, but it's my favorite. I was at a wedding. This was actually one that I was just attending in the back. And but there was a bunch of candles up on stage here. And then there was also a bunch of greenery up on stage. And those two things normally don't mix very well. And so the singer gets up. There's a soloist. She gets up and she starts singing like some beautiful, like, Ave Maria or something. You don't ask me to be your singer. And she starts singing that. And as she is singing it, one of the plants catches on fire behind her. And then it goes from one to the next. And now all these people start running up on stage and just like stomping out fire. The singer doesn't know what to do, so she just keeps on singing. And it's like a scene from The Godfather, like the church is burning down, she's just singing. And, I always tell them, like, something will go wrong. I say it, though, primarily from personal experience, because whenever Beth and I got married, not only did something go wrong, literally everything went wrong, because we got married on June 30th, 2012, and it was the night before we had the rehearsal and the rehearsal dinner. Everything went beautiful. We all went back to the different houses that we were staying at, and there was a thunderstorm coming in, but we didn't think anything about it until we woke up the next morning and realized, oh no, there's no power. And then come to find out, it was this giant storm that knocked out power for 5 million people up in the area, Northern Virginia, where we had the wedding at. And so now, nobody had power. The whole entire city of D.C. shut down there. And so I'm trying to call Beth, like, hey, what's happening? I don't even have cell phone service. So I'm just like, get in my car, start taking off to the little chapel, being like, maybe, hopefully somebody's there. Finally, I get a hold of her, and she's like, the wedding venue, the place that we're going to have the wedding, doesn't have power either. And it's 95 degrees with like 100% humidity that day. And we're like, what are we going to? So we end up moving the wedding ceremony on the day of the wedding from the wedding venue to the reception area at another place that did still have electricity at least. And so I was like, okay, I'll go over to the reception area with the groomsmen, and we were trying to rearrange and make an aisle down the middle so we could, walk down the middle. And she and her bridesmaid then start calling through the guest list. And so people were getting calls from the bride on the morning of the wedding being like, oh yeah, don't go to that church, go to the other church. And literally everything that could go wrong seemed like it did. Even our wedding cake, as they were driving in like a hectic, frantic way to get from one place to the next, it fell over. And then they had to go back and like redecorate it, but the house didn't have power, so they were having to like hold a flashlight in their mouth while they were redecorating the cake. Like everything, I'm telling you, it went wrong there. The reason why I bring all this up is today we're actually going to look at a wedding as well where something goes horribly, horribly wrong. And you might be here today and be like, listen, Joel, I'm already married and I'm never going to do that again, so this doesn't have anything to do with me. Or you might say, like, I'm married and divorced and I'm never getting married again. Like, this has nothing to do with me. But we're going to use it now because just like there's something that always goes wrong in a wedding ceremony, there are things that go wrong in life, isn't there? There's always things that are unexpected. There's always things that come up, that pop up in our life where we say, you know what? I didn't plan on that. I didn't plan on being here. My life took a turn. How do we respond to that when your life does not go according to plan, when it goes completely wrong? Well, we are going to see now from this story of a wedding what our response as Christians should be to that here. And so if you have your Bibles, we're going to be in John 2, starting verse 1. John 2, 1. And it says, on the third day, there was a wedding in Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. And so it starts out by saying on the third day. So this is still the first week of Jesus' ministry. We've only technically known Jesus in the Gospel of John for a few days at this point here. So this is brand new. And now he goes to a wedding at Cana in Galilee. Now, a wedding is always a big deal. In whatever culture you are a part of, it is always a big deal, but especially in the Jewish culture. At that time, what would happen is if you would see a young lady that you wanted to marry, first you'd have to go convince your dad to go talk to her father and arrange all of that, right? But then you would sit down and you would start this betrothal process where you'd figure out how much money that bride was worth for a bride price. So you'd be, a couple llamas and a chicken. I don't know what the current rate was. But you would sit down. Once you figured out what the bride price was, that young man, the groom, would go back to his father's house and he would start to build on a little extension from his father's house. And that could take up to a year sometimes for him to build this new house on his father's property there, after which he built it up. He would also be saving up a bunch of money in order that he could throw the biggest party that anyone has ever seen. And so about a year later, after he starts to build up this house and he has enough money, he would go get his bride and then he would bring her back and they would have kind of the wedding reception there. For 7 straight days, it was a wedding reception, a wedding party like no other here. Now, if you are here today and you are an extrovert and you hear about a 7-day party, you're like, sign me up. That sounds awesome. All the introverts, though, are like, 7-day wedding reception. No, thank you. I'm going to be sitting at a table with Aunt Mildred for 7 days. And so this is what, though, would happen. They would bring it back, and for 7 days, you would eat the food, you would drink the wine here. And basically, however big that party was a way for the groom to show off, I'm going to be a good husband to this woman. I'm going to take care of her. Look how grand of a party that I have thrown for my new bride. I am a good husband here. It's all put on by that groom. And so now we see this wedding, and notice it's Mary, the mother of Jesus, was there. And then also, Jesus was invited, so it's probably like a friend of the family at this point, or maybe a distant relative or something like that. So both Jesus and his mother were there, and then also his disciples as well were there. Now, Nathaniel, one of the disciples, was actually from this area, so maybe he was invited, but probably the rest of them were just good old-fashioned wedding crashers. Jesus brings his friends. He has 5 disciples at this point, so not all 12, but 5 disciples he brings with him. And everything seems perfect on the outside. Everything is like, that perfect wedding day here and that perfect celebration until we get to verse 3 when it says, when the wine ran out. Now, that's not good. And even in the weddings in 2024, like if the wine runs out, if the drinks run out there, then that would be a problem, right? But if it happened in the year 2024, what would we do? We would be like, Walmart run now, right? We would go to Costco, we'd go Sam's Club, we'd just buy whatever they got, bring it back here. We'll let the party go on. And so we could make it work here in the year 2024. But back then, they didn't just have Sam's Club down the street. Like the wine that was made for this wedding actually they started making that process like a year in advance to that. So if the wine runs out, there is no more way to get any more wine there. And then even more, that was just a big thing for the groom now as a point of shame, because he should have been able to provide for everybody. Now he's going to be embarrassed in front of his bride. He's going to be embarrassed in front of the father-in-law. He's going to be embarrassed in front of everybody. It's a shameful thing that the wine has run out there, because as long as there's wine, there is still going to be a party. And then they had to get to the end of 7 days before they could actually officially get married and consummate their marriage here. So this was a big thing. I even read one rabbi wrote like several thousand years ago, he wrote like, hey, as long as there's wine at a party, the party can go on. I was like, was that a rabbi or a frat guy? I don't know who wrote that, but now it says that the wine rant, this would have been devastating. It would have completely ended the wedding. It would have been a shameful thing for that groom here because now it looks like he's not going to be a good husband to his new bride here, an embarrassment to the town. And so mother of Jesus, Mary, comes to Jesus now and says they have no wine. Now, we don't know why this was Mary's job. Maybe she was just such a good friend of the family here that she had some insider information before anybody else did. Maybe she was just one of them good old moms. I love y'all where like immediately you just know when something's wrong and you're like, I need to bake a casserole. You know, like you gotta do something. Maybe that's the type of mom she was. Maybe, and this is kind of my favorite theory, is like Jesus also brings 5 like fully grown men to this wedding for a 6-day wedding with an open bar. And she's like, Peter done drank all the wine, Jesus. Like yeah, this is your fault. And it's like, they were all sailors too. She's like, have you not heard drunk as a sailor? Like it's a term. And so maybe she's like that. Honestly, though, it's probably even the fact that, notice there's no mention of Joseph at this point. Joseph, his earthly father, has probably passed away now. And so now the mother of Jesus, she relies on Jesus, her oldest son, on a lot of things, right? And if she ever has a problem at all, she probably went to Jesus. Like, the man never had a bad idea. The man always had good solutions to every issue, whether it was supernatural or not. Like, he was just wise beyond his years. So now there's a problem, and she does what she probably always did, was go to Jesus. Say, son, I need your help. There's an issue here. What should we do? And you would think now, if Jesus is sitting at this wedding of somebody he knew, this sweet couple, you know, in love at the start of their marriage, and now his mother, the Blessed Mary, comes over and asks him for a favor, you would think Jesus would have said, of course, Mom, let me get right on that. But in verse 4, he says, woman, what does this have to do with me? Not really the expected response, right? My hour has not come yet. And I never thought that I would say this in a sermon, but children, do not follow Jesus' example on this one, all right? like I just envision on Mother's Day of all days, like a mom asking her son for a drink later, and the son's like, woman, like, what does this have to do with me? It's like your time has come, son. Like, it's on, so he can get away with it. He's God. You're not. All right, you're 7. Number 1, when he says woman, that was not, like, I wouldn't say that to my mom, obviously, because that's not how we speak. But in that time period, that term would be more like ma'am. It was still a respectful term there. So he wasn't being derogatory towards her, but rather it would be like ma'am. Now notice, he could have said mother. He didn't say mother, so he is separating himself a little bit from her. Because at this moment now, he's going to have to show her as well. Like, I'm not going to do my mom's business, I'm going to do my father's business now. And so he says, ma'am, what does this have to do with me? Essentially, he's saying, listen, that should have been the groom's job. The groom had the job to provide for the wedding. The groom had the job to make sure that there was going to be enough wine for everybody to be able to drink and have there here. That isn't my place or my job to step in for that. Why are you involving me in this? This is somebody else's role at this wedding here. And then he goes on to say, my hour has not yet come. There was a whole process here that he was one day going to reveal himself as Lord to everybody, but that hour hadn't yet come. He hasn't even assembled all 12 of his disciples yet, and so he's like, this isn't your role here, mother. Now, I will say this. I don't think Mary was wrong in bringing that concern to Jesus. I think Jesus just wanted her to know that if I do this miracle, it's because I decided to do this miracle. It was for my plan and my purposes. And this is the same thing for us. When we come and we have an issue, when we have a problem, bring it to Jesus. He actually wants us. He invites us in. He calls us to say, give me no rest. Knock on my door all night long. You bring these petitions to the Lord over and over and over again. But when we come, remember, if God is going to do something, it's because he decides to do it. Because he knows what's best here. And that's what Jesus was trying to convey. But yet, Mary still brought it. And I think that's a good reminder for us. So the first point in your bulletin is this, is what do we do when things go wrong? Ask, even when the answer is not yet. That's essentially what the answer was. My hour has not come yet. I'm not going to just answer this in the way that you want me to. I'm not going to answer it because you asked it, but I have a good plan here, mother. And you need to trust me in that. In the same way, when we go through hardships and we don't know what else to do, take it to the Lord and start to ask and petition and give him no rest. You go and you ask and you ask and you ask, but yet you also just say, Lord, I'm going to trust that you are going to work this out in the way that you want to work it out here. So in the next verse now we see his mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. And I think, mamas, they know their sons. I think Mary knew Jesus probably better than anyone at this point. And she could probably see oh yeah, he's going to do it. And but at the same time, notice that she also, there's this idea of submission even in this here. She doesn't say something like, you better do it. No, she says to her servants, hey, do whatever he says. And I think that this genuinely means whatever he tells you. So if he tells you to make more wine, then you go make more wine. If he tells you to go sit down, then you go sit down and you wait. Whatever is in his plan here. And this is what our attitude should be. Whenever we bring something to the Lord here, sometimes he's going to say, not yet. Sometimes he's going to say, wait. And sometimes the answer might not even come in this life. Some of us have been praying for healing over a sickness. Maybe God will heal us. Maybe it will be today. Maybe it'll be in a year. Maybe it won't be until heaven. But we can still bring those prayers and those requests to the Lord here. This is what Mary says. And this is actually going to be the last words that Mary's recorded as saying in the Gospels. She's brought up later, but this is really the last, chronologically speaking, probably the last thing that she says here that we have record of. And what a great testimony of just do whatever Jesus says. Do whatever Jesus says. Mothers, let that be your testimony to your children as well. Just do what Jesus tells you. I'm not going to manipulate. I'm not going to try to maneuver it here. I just want to point my kids back to Jesus. This was the last thing. And so now, what does Jesus do? In verse 6, it goes on to say, now there were 6 stone water jars there for Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Now, this verse, as you're reading through it, it almost kind of seems like a verse that we skip over because it's just kind of providing a little bit extra context to what's about to happen. But in all reality, this might just be the most important verse in this passage because it shapes everything that's about ready to happen. There's a lot of context clues that we miss being 2,000 years removed from the actual story here. And this has a lot of clues that if it was modern day and I was telling you a story, you could fill in the gaps, right? For instance, if I was going to tell you a story about somebody and I'm like, man, this guy drove up in a brand new shiny Mercedes. You'd be like, okay, you would know that, here's a wealthy man, right? If I were to say, yeah, this person drove up in a 15-passenger van, homeschoolers. you would know. You could put the context together, right? There's a lot of context clues that you might have missed. Number one, notice it says 6 stone water jars. In that time period, according to archaeological records and history and all of that, the vast majority of people would have been using clay water jars. And not stone. Clay was way easier and cheaper to make because you could just go outside and get the clay and form it. It was easy. It was something you could do, everybody could do here. But if you had stone water jars, it meant that 2 things were true of you. Number one, it meant that you were wealthy, because you had to be able to pay somebody to go down to the rock quarry, get a giant boulder of a rock, and then slowly chip it away until it becomes one vase or one jar here. And so this meant that this person, whoever it was a very wealthy person, or at least was trying to portray wealth to everybody. But then also it meant that this person cared a lot about the Jewish law. Because at this point here, if you had a clay pot, according to the Old Testament law, it was really easy to get those ceremonially unclean. And so if you go back and read Leviticus, and I know you got it memorized, but like if you read Leviticus and you get a clay pot dirty, then you're supposed to take it outside and smash it up because it was so cheap and easy to make. And if it got dirty, just destroy it. But you don't do that with a stone jar, because you can't destroy a stone jar. So there was actually an exception made for the Jewish Old Testament law that says, no, if they get clean, like you can just clean it off here. You don't have to destroy it. So whoever had stone water jars cared a lot about making sure that they were following the Old Testament law. So because this exception was made for them. So this person now is somebody that cares a lot about the Jewish law, is a wealthy person. And then it goes on to say, because why? Because this was for the Jewish rites of purification. The Jewish rites of purification, that means a cleanliness. Now, you go back and you read through the Old Testament law, you'll see that there were a lot of laws about being clean as a people. But what starts to happen is it's really only a couple chapters about being clean. And so it's like if you get, blood on you or a discharge or something like that, then you're supposed to clean yourself off. But what was happening in the time of Jesus now is that they would actually start to take this a lot farther. And they got these stone jars holding about 20 or 30 gallons. This isn't stone, but it's about 20 or 30 gallons. So they would be 6 of these now. And what they would do here is before every single meal, they would actually start to cleanse themselves. Now, once again, this actually isn't in the Bible. It's just what they started to do with tradition. And so these Pharisees, these Sadducees, before every single meal, they would go above and beyond what the Bible actually tells them to, and they would wash their hands in a very particular way. They would first hold it down and let the water run down it here to make sure they were clean. And then they would actually hold it up here and wash each finger and go slowly through that and pour it on here. And then they would do the other side. And then they would actually take a fist and they'd start to clean and with their fist wipe away any of the dirt or the grime that is on their hand here. And they would take a long time to do this here. Think of like COVID 2020 hand washing style. Like you're just cleaning everything off. And then they would do this before they started the meal. And then if they had another course, so you'd do it before the appetizer, and then you'd do it before the main course, you'd get up again and you'd do it, and then if you had dessert, you would get up again and you'd do it. They could do this 4 or 5 times. They would stand up, go to the wash table, and wash their hands in order that they are going to be completely clean here. And you say, why in the world did they do this? Well, there were Pharisees and Sadducees at that time that started to say, well, if I am clean on the outside, it means that God must think I'm clean on the inside. And Jesus says, no, that's never what it's been about. That's never what it's been about. Because we know now in the year 2024, just because you're clean on the outside, it doesn't actually mean you're clean, right? I remember taking that food safety course for my first job as a high schooler to work at, a fast food chain and all that. And I just remember the teacher saying yeah, just because something looks clean doesn't mean that it's actually clean, right? My hands look clean. They're not clean anymore, right? Some of you are like, I'm never shaking the hands with that guy. It's not sanitary anymore. It's not clean. But they started to think, well, as long as I look clean on the outside, then that is good enough here. And what these Jewish pots here, they represented the Old Testament law. They represented all the Pharisaical laws on top of laws on top of laws that said, we can get clean, we can do it ourselves here, we can do it by our own effort here, is what these 6 pots of 180 gallons worth of cleanliness wine here. And even more than that, when you start to compare some of the maps in the Old Testament to the New Testament, you'll learn that there was 24 different cities for which the priests lived in Israel. They didn't have just one plot of land like all the other tribes. They had 24 cities spread out. One of those cities in the Old Testament ended up becoming into Cana of Galilee. Meaning, all of this together is that this was likely actually a wedding for a Jewish priest and his family. And they cared deeply about following the Old Testament law. And so everything that was happening here was just a symbol of this Old Testament law. Here's a groom that was probably also a priest representing the Old Testament law here. And yet he could not provide for his wife. He could not do the things that he was supposed to do here. And it's all now going to be flawed. And this is the symbol for which Jesus is about ready to step in and do his first miracle. So verse 7 comes up to say, Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, now draw some of it out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. Now, there's no reason to assume that all these jars were completely empty. They probably still had some water in them here, but at the same time, they probably brought all 6 of these jars out just for the fact that they wouldn't have to go and fill them up again, right? And so these servants now get this order from Jesus, who nobody knows who Jesus is yet. Nobody knows what he can do, but yet he gives this weird request of fill up more water. And if I was a servant, I'd be like, well, this isn't going to help. We're out of wine. We're not out of water. Why are we having to do this? Further all, there was no water hose back then. There's no spigot. You would have to actually walk down to the well. Sometimes people would have to walk over a mile to get water. So they was now servants probably walking back and forth, trying to get water as quick as they could to bring it back up, just to fill up these tanks again. And he says, fill them up to the brim. Which, if these are symbolizing the Old Testament law, a reminder that Jesus didn't come to abolish the law, but he came to fulfill it. So he says, hey, fill it up to the brim. And then he said to him, now take some out. What's the some? That's still actually talking about the water. He's like, now take some of the water out and take it to the master of the feast. The master of the feast was kind of like the wedding planner. The master of the feast would have been the servant's boss. And they're probably thinking I don't really want to do that. The master of the feast hasn't yet figured out that there's no wine yet. And I'm pretty sure if I just bring them a glass of water, they're going to know that something is up here. I don't want to do that. But they took it. But they filled it up. None of the requests yet of what Jesus was making made any sense to anybody. They had a problem. They were out of wine. Why are they filling up water jars again? But yet, the servants obeyed. The servants obeyed. And that's the next point in your bulletin is that when things go wrong, obey even when it doesn't make sense. Even when it doesn't make sense. Because it wasn't until they obeyed did God do the miracle. Things are going to go bad in our life as well. Some of us are going to get really sick one day. Do you know that you can still have joy even when you're sick? You can still obey the Lord even when you're sick. Some of us are in really, really bad marriages right now, and our husband or our spouse is just treating us horribly. Did you know that you can still treat your spouse with love and respect even when they don't treat you right? Did you know that? Did you know that you can still be obedient? Even if you're facing a financial hardship, you can still be obedient and be generous. Even if you are going through a hard time, we still obey. We can't control what other people do, but we can control what we do. And we're going to say, listen, I'm going to keep obeying God even when it doesn't make sense, because the miracle was on the other side of the obedience. And if sometimes we want to see God work, well, let's make sure that we are actually obeying what God says. Because this might be the whole reason why. He's like, do you trust me even now here? And so what happens on this other side? Verse 9 says, when the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it had come from. The servants who had drawn the water knew, which they were probably just like, what is happening right now? I took a glass of water over to them, and he starts drinking, and now all of a sudden, everything has turned into wine now. And so now, the master of the feast calls to the bridegroom, the groom, who probably still is also oblivious to the fact that they are now out of wine now. Verse 10, he says to him, master of the feast says to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when the people had drunk freely, then the poor wine, but you have kept the good wine until now. And so normally in this context, you would serve all the good stuff, get people a little bit drunk, and then you'd pull out the box wine. But instead now, he's like, no, the new is better than the old. What did the old represent from that old priest? The old represented the Old Testament law. The old represented you trying to get to God your way here by your own effort. And now Jesus comes in and says, this new wine, this new covenant is so much better than the old. But notice, nobody knew this yet. Jesus didn't reveal himself like his mother might have wanted him to initially. Jesus doesn't reveal himself, I'm going to do it my way. I did the miracle, but nobody even knew about it. If you were a Jewish person reading this 2,000 years ago, you would read it and you'd say, man, John is just showing how much better Jesus is than the Old Testament covenant, than the Old Testament law. He is so much better than anything else. But John was such a good storyteller. The Apostle John, who wrote this book, that he was doing a couple different things and we didn't even notice it 2,000 years removed. Because while the Jewish person would read this story and no doubt see the symbolism of the Old Testament law, being at a priest's house and knowing all of this here and Jesus coming in and being the better version of that here, for his audience, though, John's audience wasn't just Jewish people, it was also to the whole world. And if you were a Greek, if you were a Gentile, you would read this and say, oh, that's not what he's saying. He's saying something else because he's a good storyteller. See, back 2,000 years ago, they had all sorts of different gods. The Greek pantheon, they had all sorts of different gods for which people would go to temples and worship and all that. And we don't know a lot about them anymore here from the average person, but most of us have probably heard of Zeus, right? Zeus was kind of the big dog. He was the main god there up at top of everything here. And Zeus, the most powerful, mighty god there was in their mind, had a son named Dionysus. Now, Dionysus is one that we don't talk about a lot anymore, but he was a big deal back then. Why? Because he was one of the gods of Zeus. And even if you go back to Athens, there was a Parthenon, and then kind of down the street, there was another big temple for Dionysus. And everybody loved Dionysus, and everybody wanted to serve him. You know why? Because Dionysus was the god of wine. They said actually his blood was wine, and you would drink his blood. That might sound familiar when we get to the end of John. And so now these people, they love this god of Dionysus, right? Like they would come and he would have the best parties at Dionysus' house, his temple there. And I was going to show you a picture, but apparently, I could not find a picture of him where he's wearing pants, which is on point for the god of wine, I think. But people loved serving the god of Dionysus. Why? Because a legend has it that god could turn water into wine. And in the springtime, every single year, there was now a festival where they'd have a wedding. By the way, this wedding was also in the springtime. And they would have a wedding here in Athens where they would go inside the temple and they would celebrate this wedding between Dionysus and this other goddess here. And they would bring it all in here and they would close the doors and have this secret wedding in secret here. But then after a couple days here, they would open up the door and the priest would come out and say, wonderful news, Dionysus has been married, and as a gift to you, he has turned water into wine. And they would pour out the wine on the steps of the temple there and let the wine run out, an overabundance of what they needed here. And then everybody would rejoice, and everybody would drink, and everybody would celebrate. Why? Because there is a god named Dionysus, and he has done this wonderful miracle. They couldn't figure out how these priests could have done it, but yet they celebrated. Why? Because he has done this awesome miracle. You know why I love this story? Is every Greek person would have known that story. And then when we get to verse 11 of this story, it says this, the first of his signs. The first of Jesus' signs. John is very intentional about what he includes in his book. He's going to include 6 more for a total of 7 different signs. And it's almost like everybody knew that story of Dionysus. Knew that story of this mighty God who could do this awesome miracle of turning water into wine. And now it really feels like Jesus is kind of just sitting back here at the wedding and saying, oh, Dionysus, that's a cute miracle you got there. Because it's my first one. This isn't Jesus' big trick. This isn't Jesus' big miracle. Because now what is happening? John is saying this was only the first. This was the greatest miracle of your favorite God. That is the biggest thing that he could do. This is just the start of Jesus. He says, if you thought this was cool, wait till you see what I can do with a dead body in an empty grave. And he now is going to showcase whether you are Jewish, he is so much better than the old system. Whether you are a Gentile, he's so much better than all the other gods that you could worship here. Jesus is better than all of this. And so what was the purpose for it all? It says Jesus did this at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, made his glory great for the purpose of this, so that his disciples believed in him. The whole reason why this story happened was so that his disciples would actually believe in him, would believe in him. And that's the last point in your bulletin now, is what to do when things go wrong. Believe. Because bad things happen so we can see God come through. Bad things happen so we can see God come through. Listen, some of us are going to go through a very difficult time. Some of us currently are going through a very difficult season right now, aren't we? Some of us have gotten sick. But let me remind you, you cannot see that God is truly a healer until you first get sick. You can't see how good of a provider God is until you learn to go without. You can't see how good of a redeemer Jesus is until we are so ensnared in sin and we can't get out. It's only when Jesus steps in instead here. We cannot see that he's a good reconciler until the broken relationship has to be put back into place. We can't see that he's a life giver until somebody dies and is brought back to life. We go through these things. The reason why bad things happen at that wedding, the reason why bad things happen in your life is so that we can see God come through. You know, my wedding, thinking back to it, everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong in my wedding. But as I'm thinking back over it, I don't remember all of those bad things nearly as much. You know what I remember about my wedding day? Was when I was standing up here on this stage and those back doors started to open wide, and as those back doors started to open wide, I saw my beautiful bride for the very first time walk into that door. The thing that I remember wasn't all the bad things that happened. The thing that was so impactful to me was that I got to see my bride. And whenever I meet with a young couple and I tell them, hey, by the way, bad things are going to happen in your wedding day. Things are going to go wrong, but you know what else I tell them? I always look them in the eye and I say, but guess what? You're going to be married at the end of the day, and it's going to be the best day of your life. And one day for us as well, Jesus Christ is going to come down to earth, get his bride, bring us back up to heaven one day. And there's going to be a marriage feast of the Lamb that's unlike any other day that you've ever been a part of. I was at a beautiful wedding even last week. I overheard somebody say, this is the perfect day. I wish it would go on forever. This day that we get to experience up in heaven is the first day of forever. And we aren't going to remember all the bad things that happened to get us there. We're going to just rejoice in the fact that we're with the one that we love. And that is why sometimes we go through hard things, is so that we can see Jesus Christ come through for us. With every head bowed, every eye closed. If you're here today and you've never put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, let it start there. If you're here today and you are a Christian, let's remember that even when bad things happen, we can still obey God. We can still take our requests to him. We can still believe in him. Father, we love you, Lord. I lift up those in this congregation right now that are not sure that they have a relationship with you. I pray that they would settle that here today, that they would not leave before calling out to you, repenting of their sins and believing in you, Lord. I pray for all those that are believers right now that are going through a difficult season. Lord, whatever goes wrong, I pray that you would remind them of what is ahead, that it is worth it. Whatever they go through is going to be worth it, because one day we get to be with you. We love you, Lord. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.